Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a moment to join us online, and then we'll get started. All right, and we have folks who are still joining, so we'll give everyone just a few more seconds to get online, and then we'll get the webinar started. All right, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this webinar on advocating for sex education in Texas. My name is Jennifer Biendo, and I am Director of Policy and Data for the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. And with me is Eleni Pacheco, Program Director and Health Educator for Healthy Futures of Texas in San Antonio. We're here today to talk about the incredible opportunity that Texas advocates have to improve sex education standards. Over and over again, research supports the value of evidence-based, medically accurate sex education for our students. And we're so glad that you're with us here today to learn more about this important work. So a little bit about the Texas Campaign. We are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization founded in 2009 to reduce the rate of teen pregnancy in Texas through research and data, strategic collaboration, advocacy and public policy, and training and events. And I'll turn it over to Eleni to talk about Healthy Futures of Texas.
Hey everyone, yeah, I'm coming from Healthy Futures of Texas. We've been around since 2006, and since then we've seen a major decline in teen pregnancy. So I'm pretty excited to be working with Healthy Futures. We've got our youth education programs, parent education programs. We work with community college students to make sure that they can attain their educational goals. And we also do a lot of youth development and curriculum design. So we're really hoping to build up our, generation of young leaders to make sure that they have all of the information that they're needing and that they're wanting to make sure that they can make the healthiest decisions for themselves. So we advocate at local and state levels to make sure that that education is available to them as well.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So ahead of us this afternoon, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about why sex education matters. We know that we're preaching to the choir here, but we think it's important to go through. And then we'll talk about the current landscape of sex education policy in Texas. We'll go over what exactly is happening at the State Board of Education in the TEKS revision process and how you as advocates can get involved. And then finally, we'll take questions and answers. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen below to ask questions. That will be on the black ribbon that comes up if you hover on the bottom of the screen. And we'll take all questions at the end of the webinar. You can also use the chat function to talk directly to panelists if you need to. So some required disclosures. Thank you to the Texas Department of State Health Services for sponsoring continuing education credits for this webinar. So successful completion of CEUs requires you to complete the online registration, listen live to the webinar, and then complete the participant evaluation that we will send out immediately after you close the webinar. That will automatically launch on your screen. Some more required disclosures, and please complete that evaluation no later than February 25th to get continuing education credits. And we are offering continuing medical education credits, continuing nursing education credits, credits for social workers, health education specialists, public health, and licensed professional counselors. So, a question for everyone joining us today: why does sex education matter? And we would love to hear from you. So if you're joining us through the computer, please pull up the chat box on the bottom of your screen and type in why sex education matters for Texas students. In other words, why are you here with us today to learn how to advocate? And we'll give everyone a moment to enter in there. And so we've got a wonderful and very simple response. Because our young people deserve better. Thank you, Veronica. We agree. We think that the young people of Texas deserve the highest quality sex education that they can. All right. So a few reasons why we believe that sex education matters. And we have one more great one. Sex education helps kids make better and more informed reproductive decisions. Thanks, Diana. That is absolutely true, and research supports over and over again the value of sex education in helping kids make healthy decisions. And we also see that sex education matters because almost 63% of high school seniors report having engaged in sexual activity before graduation. This is also true. We know that this can be an uncomfortable topic when we talk about adolescence and sex, but we know that the data show us that a majority of Texas teens, by the time they're in their senior year of high school, are sexually active. So we know it's important to get them this key and critical information. And then we also have a great response. Sex education matters so that sex and sex-related issues aren't taboo, and kids can feel comfortable asking questions and insisting on consent. That is a wonderful reply. We know that it's important that our kids are able to talk about these issues, and so that they can talk about them when they're adults as well, and really engage in healthy relationships that are based in consent. Great. All right. So let's look at some of the data that supports sex education. We're going to have to reshare this PowerPoint, sorry. Having a little bit of technical issues. All right, we're back. All right, so one thing that research shows is that sex education matters to address teen pregnancy and teen birth rates from a prevention standpoint. So the data show us that Texas consistently has one of the highest rates of both teen birth and repeat teen birth in the nation. We're currently the 9th highest rate of teen birth in the nation, which is an improvement from 4th several years ago. The good news is that teen birth rates in Texas are on the decline. They have declined by about 50% in the last decade alone. And this really mirrors nationwide trends and also trends in other states. We see this similar decline in just about every state in the nation. So what does that mean for actual rates? That means that in 2007, 6% of Texas teens gave birth each year. And in 2018, that had declined to just 2.5% of Texas teens. So really a pretty staggering rate of decline. However, there were still more than 25,000 teen births in Texas in 2018 alone. And Texas does have the highest rate of repeat teen birth in the nation. That means that about 1 in 5 teen births in Texas are actually a repeat birth, meaning the teen already has at least one baby. And teen birth rates in Texas are higher than teen birth rates in the US. And similarly, the teen birth rates in the US are higher than those of other similar developed nations. What are the reasons for this really amazing decline that we've been seeing in teen birth rates? This is a complex and nuanced issue, but we do see some key factors really pushing some of that decline. One is changes in behavior. So we are seeing a decline in actual incidence of sex in Texas high school students. The percent of any grade level who ever report being sexually active decreased from 53% to 39% in about a decade. However, as previously mentioned, by the time they're seniors in high school, 63% of students still report being sexually active. We are seeing better contraceptive usage, and we see that teens have more access to some of the most effective methods of birth control, like long-acting reversible contraception or LARCs. We're also seeing a better flow of information. There's more accurate information out there, whether it comes from parents, from high-quality internet sources, or from school-based sex education. Unfortunately, we're also seeing a lot of low quality information. And what we know is if we don't provide high quality information for teens, they will go somewhere to get information and it may or may not be accurate. And this is difficult to measure, but we are also seeing some cultural shifts that can reflect changing attitudes towards things like parenthood, generational attitudes towards risky behaviors, economic pressures, and even things like smartphone usage. We're seeing that kids spend more time in a virtual world, and Snapchat cannot get you pregnant. However, these declines are not consistent across all populations, and we still see immense disparities in teen birth rates, both in Texas and in the US. So the map shows teen birth rates by counties, and you can see some definite geographic clustering in the areas with high teen birth rates. So we see, as we mentioned, that teen birth rates are higher among teens who have already had a baby. Older teens are more likely to have a teen birth than younger teens. We see real disparities among youth of color and youth living in poorer areas. They have much higher rates of teen birth and teen pregnancy. Many people think of teen birth as an urban phenomenon, but we actually see that youth living in rural counties are more likely to experience early birth and pregnancy. Youth in conservatorship or foster care and youth with high rates of adverse childhood experiences or a trauma history also are more likely to have high teen birth rates. And youth experiencing intimate partner violence also are unduly at risk. So despite this decline in teen birth rates, we do see that rates of sexually transmitted infections are on the rise. And this is another reason why it's so important to get medically accurate sex education out to our youth. So chlamydia and gonorrhea diagnoses among youth age 15 to 24 have increased by 25% in Texas in the last decade, and HIV diagnoses have increased by about 4%. So in 2018 in Texas, we had more than 93,000 cases of chlamydia and more than 23,000 cases of gonorrhea. Some of this data is due to better screening and disease surveillance. We're doing a much better job of universal testing for things like chlamydia. And so when we do more testing, we do find more cases, which is good because then we can treat diseases that could cause long-term issues such as infertility. However, there does also appear to be a true increase in STI incidence. One of the reasons behind this may be that HIV is now perceived as more of a manageable disease like diabetes rather than a death sentence, and that can lead to declining condom rates. And so we've talked a lot about prevention. We offer sex ed to help prevent these bad outcomes, but we know that it's not all about prevention or even mostly about prevention. Sex education is also critical to cultivate healthy relationships. And I'll turn this over to our health educator, Eleni, to talk more on this topic.
Awesome. So yeah, actually, social and emotional learning skills are some of my favorite skills that I believe all young people should have access to, and they're so intrinsically tied into sex education. What social emotional skills based education is about is really centering on relationships. And as humans, social animals, our entire world is centered on relationships. So what we do in social and emotional learning is we exercise an awareness of ourselves as well as the social bonds that we create. And then we think about how we can make responsible decisions with both of those relationships in mind, both with ourselves and with other people. I think that social and emotional relationship skills are really foundational to developing responsive rather than reactive, functioning adult people. It also goes into just building the practicality of sex education. So, for example, Jen, can you tell me some characteristics of a healthy relationship?
Absolutely. It's one that's not based in control. It's based in mutual respect. It's marked by positive communication, kindness towards each other. Those are a few things that immediately spring to mind.
Great. So we said not based in control. We mentioned respect and positive communication. And a lot of young people can state those things as well because we've already strung along those sentences and fed them to them. So they're already there for them to state. But I find that as an educator, the students that I'm working with have a really difficult time identifying those characteristics in a relationship. They don't realize that emotional abuse can equate to stalking, right? And they don't understand words, abstract concepts like trust and love, and what is the difference between positive communication. So, for example, passionate communication versus abusive communication. They don't have the practical skills, the social and emotional skills-based education to really apply those to their lives. So identifying the intention behind those abstract concepts is very difficult for them. It's because these are the things that they see in the media. These are the things that they've already seen played out in their environments with other young people that are, involved in intimate partner violence, whether that's physical violence or emotional violence. So what we do with sexual health education is we don't just address those abusive behaviors and give them definition. We don't just provide support and resources for young people who have been through intimate partner violence, but we want to address the young people who could potentially become abusers and nip that in the bud, make sure that they don't end up becoming abusive as they grow older.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleni, for sharing your on-the-ground experience. It's really helpful to hear how it all comes into context. So now we'll talk a little bit about the current policy landscape that shapes the provision of sex education in Texas. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. So Texas is one of 26 states that do not require sex education for high school graduation. This was a policy change that happened a little bit more than 10 years ago. And as a result, we've found that the percentage of Texas school districts that offer any sex education at all dramatically declined. So currently, the best estimates are that 58% of Texas school districts offer abstinence-only sex education at the high school level. 17% offer abstinence plus sex education, which posits abstinence as the healthiest and best choice, but also provides medically accurate information on things like risk reduction, healthy relationships, and other important topics that we think kids need. And then 25% of districts provide no sex ed at all at the high school level. Now, health class is offered at the middle school level, but the current TEKS have a very minimal sex ed component at the middle school level for TEKS.
And if I may address the abstinence-only education.
Absolutely.
So one thing about abstinence-only education is that it can work wonders in providing refusal skills. And a lot of times young people aren't really taught to say no or how to say no or that they have the right to say no. And so I think that abstinence education gets that correct, which is why I'm a big proponent for abstinence plus education, because as an adult who was once a young person who didn't really understand my right to say no, I believe that refusal skills are foundational. But there is persistent confusion. The University of Chicago reports that adults in this country, men and women, have persistent confusion about consent and what constitutes sexual assault. And abstinence-only education doesn't exactly cover that type of education as well. So I think that there's a lot of value in understanding the yes as well as the no. Because abstinence education, we talk about boundaries, we talk about limits and refusal skills, but what we don't talk about is when someone is okay or is comfortable with something, how do they address that? And what I find on the ground when I'm educating is that when I go in and I teach my abstinence education lessons, the young people, when they're talking to me and we kind of break out into that discussion part, they are a little bit stressed out about it because they feel like the relationships that they enter are going to be based in rejection, and they don't know how to mitigate what is it that I'm okay with. Maybe I'm okay with making out, but I'm not okay with taking off my clothes, for example, or I'm not okay with touching each other above the clothes, breast or buttocks. What is it that I am okay with, and how do I communicate that so that my relationship isn't about rejection, but it's more about compromise and negotiation? And negotiation is something that we talk about a lot with abstinence. I actually had a young person tell me that understanding both sides of the coin is important. His name is Jason. He's in my youth advocacy council. And he mentioned that it's critical for young people, and especially young men, to understand both yes and no, because learning these skills prevent them from unintentionally assaulting friends, acquaintances, and partners. And we know that 2/3 of people who are assaulted by someone that they know. So he believes that, especially in the context of the #MeToo movement, we need to build a culture of consent amongst young people and a peer culture as well, not only by condemning behaviors that are assaultive or aren't respectful of boundaries, but by rewarding behaviors that are. And the only way we can do this is by understanding what behaviors are respectful and consensual.
Thank you, Eleni. And as a mother of 2 sons, I could not agree more on what I hope that they learn prior to adulthood. So now we'll talk a little bit about the decision-making authority over sex education in Texas. So we're a state that very much believes in local control. And so we have a fairly complex layer of local and state control around sex education. So at the top, we have the state legislature. The state legislature writes the laws that govern sex education, and then also determines the credits that are needed for K-12 education and graduation. What we're talking about today primarily is the State Board of Education, or the SBOE. So the SBOE has a number of roles, but around curriculum and instruction, they are responsible for setting the minimum curriculum standards by topic and grade level. These are the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or TEKS. They're also responsible for reviewing and adopting instructional materials and also establishing some graduation requirements. We also have the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, who supports the State Board of Education in this work and will manage the work groups that are writing the actual text for these TEKS revisions. The commissioner also made a series of recommendations to the SBOE about the sex education revisions. And then we have the local school districts. In a state like Texas, a great deal of control is given to local school districts to decide what, if anything, will be taught around sex education. And I know that many of the participants joining us today are from ISDs, and many have worked to support sex education in their own districts. So the local school district selects the actual curriculum that will achieve the TEKS for their local students. They determine which electives to offer, and then crucially, they train teachers to deliver the actual content. And then finally, we have these school health advisory councils, or the SHACs. SHACs are required by statute in each district, and they serve as an advisory group to local school boards. They're made up of parents and other volunteers and local experts. They make recommendations on which sex education curricula to adopt, but they don't have authority to set standards or do the final curriculum selection. So let's talk a little bit more about what state law says about sex education. So as we mentioned previously, health classes are required at the middle school level, but they are elective at the high school level. And if districts do choose to teach sex ed, they must follow state law. They must present abstinence from sexual activity as the preferred choice of behavior in relationship to all sexual activity for unmarried persons of school age. And they have to devote more attention to abstinence than to any other behavior. They have to emphasize that abstinence is the only 100% effective method for preventing pregnancy, STIs, HIV/AIDS, and also the emotional trauma associated with adolescent sexual activity. That's in state statute. If they are teaching about contraception or condoms, they have to teach human use reality failure rates rather than theoretical laboratory rates, and they're not allowed to distribute condoms. The Texas Education Code, and I saw a typo on this slide. This is not in the election code, it is in the education code. The statute also lays out the process for sex education curriculum adoption with the SHAC recommendations. And it also notes that parents have to be notified of sex ed, and they have the right to remove students from classes and also review the sex education curriculum. So parents are the ultimate arbitrators of whether or not their student will receive sex education. So the State Board of Education sets the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, or TEKS. These are the minimum curriculum standards for any class. And the health TEKS are what is currently under review. The health TEKS were last revised in the 1990s, in fact, in the year that Titanic was a blockbuster hit. And so they are now undergoing a revision process for the first time in 2 decades. So it's very important to remember that the TEKS are the minimum curriculum standards. So school districts have the option of teaching far above and beyond the TEKS, but these are the minimum standards that everyone offering a health class has to meet. So there are numerous topics, all of which are very important within the health TEKS that are currently under review. It includes physical health and hygiene, mental health and wellness, healthy eating and physical activity, injury, violence prevention and safety, alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, and then finally, reproductive and sexual health, or sex ed. So these are all important topics, and so we know that schools have a lot to cover within the context of a health class, and we don't want to shortchange any of these items.
And truly, sex ed fits into almost every single category there that you see.
Absolutely. Sex ed is so closely tied to mental health and wellness, tied to alcohol and other drugs.
If you think about the data that they found, the commissioner found that the top 3 disparities in statistics between young people in Texas and young people nationwide are in suicide attempts, condom use, and birth control use. Those are the top 3 disparities. And I think that that speaks volumes to how connected sexual health is to mental wellness as well.
Absolutely, and to opportunity in general. And we know that these are all topics that parents want to talk to their children about. I certainly talk to my boys about physical activity and healthy eating and mental health, but we also know that schools are such a crucial source of information around these topics, especially for students who might not live with parents or might not have adults who have this information available to share. So let's talk a little bit about what the TEKS revisions can and can't accomplish. This is where I put on my policy wonk hat for a moment. So let's talk about what they can do. So this is truly an amazing opportunity to make real change for all Texas students. This is a wonderful and huge opportunity. We can use these TEKS revisions to provide more comprehensive information to a wider range of students, and we are very optimistic that we will be able to accomplish that. We can definitely update the info around HIVs and STIs to reflect scientific advances of the last 2 decades. A lot has changed since the 1990s, especially around HIV, and we would like to get some of that updated information there in the TEKS. We are hopeful that we can change the TEKS to reflect changes in tolerance and respect of LGBTQ+ individuals. Again, a lot has changed since the 1990s, and we want to see all youth reflected in their curriculum and respected in the classroom. And hopefully we can also change the TEKS to reflect updated understanding about consent, not just refusal in the Me Too era. However, there are some things that the TEKS revisions can't accomplish. So we are talking about the minimum curriculum standards, but we cannot specify which curriculum districts actually have to use. That's a choice that's made at the district level. We also can't require sex ed at the high school level. That's in state statutes. We cannot supersede state law requiring an abstinence first approach. So the TEKS will have to fit within state law. And we can't replicate some of the most progressive sex education curricula that we've seen adopted in districts like Austin ISD. What's appropriate for Austin might not be a fit for the rest of the state. And unfortunately, we cannot necessarily prohibit the use of shame or fear-based instructional methods. We hear from a lot of students that their sex ed, especially in more rural communities, involved things like having students chew up a piece of chewing gum and then spit it out. And that was an analogy for a person who had been sexually active. Nobody else wanted to touch them and they were now somehow dirty. And we think that can be genuinely harmful, especially for students who may have had sexual encounters that were not consensual. We would like to see that type of instruction disappear. However, we might not be able to use these TEKS revisions to accomplish that. So let's talk about what we're actually recommending. So several organizations with input from stakeholders have come up with a preliminary series of recommended revisions to the TEKS. We'd like to see improved information on contraception, including some language around long-acting reversible contraception, which is now considered to be an appropriate method for adolescents. And we'd like to see that information offered to a wider range of students. So health class is offered at the 8th grade level, And so one opportunity is to provide information about both contraception and also STI prevention to students at the 8th grade level, because we know that at least in the 8th grade level, they will receive that content. We'd like to provide updated information on the prevention and treatment of STIs and HIV and reflect the medical advances of the last 2 decades. And we'd like more information on healthy relationships, including teaching consent and not just refusal. We'd like to see inclusion and respect for LGBTQ students. And additionally, there will be a new strand on digital citizenship and online safety. This will reflect some legislation from the prior session. And this will likely include topics like sexting, digital online footprint, social media, et cetera. And we haven't talked a lot about these last 2 items, so I'd like to turn it back over to Eleni to talk about what she sees on the ground as a health educator here.
Absolutely. And if time permits, may I also touch a little bit on that birth decline and contraceptive information as well?
Absolutely.
All right. So I'll actually start there because it kind of ties really into digital citizenship and online safety. So we mentioned before that there were potentially some cultural changes that led to the teen birth decline, and being on the ground and working with young people regularly, both within the fidelity of a sex ed curriculum and within a more free space with my youth advocacy council, I think that that's absolutely true. I definitely see that there's just more scope of opportunity for young women and female identified students. So they make decisions with their personal goals in mind. They no longer have that narrow path of, I can become a mother, or I can work a minimum wage job, or, do other types of labor, domestic labor and things like that. But they have a much broader scope of opportunity. So now they're thinking, okay, what are the steps that I need to take to get there? So we still see those birth rates affecting those marginalized communities, especially in the rural areas, and then those very periphery communities in metro areas like San Antonio. Those people are very much underserved and potentially not accurately represented in policy, which is why we really have to take them into mind when we're thinking about these TEKS minimum standards as well. Another thing is that there's just less stigma talking about contraception. Young people are much more open to discussing, contraceptive options, hearing the information. They really, really enjoy getting those effectiveness rates and seeing the demos. But when it comes to something like STIs, the conversation turns a little bit in the opposite direction, to where young people are not embracing the idea of STI education, at least not the young people that I'm dealing with. And I think that's because where birth control is no longer deeply steeped in that kind of stigma, STIs really are. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that we talk about it. So, for example, what was some of the education that you may have received, Jen, on STIs?
I did not have sex education in Texas. I had sex education in Louisiana, and the only piece of my sex education that I remember was the high school teacher saying, "And I certainly hope none of you are sexually active," and some awkward looks throughout the class. And that is genuinely the only moment that I remember from my high school sex education.
Right. Yeah. So really, it's something that no one's really wanting to embrace, including teachers. And I think that's because they're not equipped to talk about STIs in a non-stigmatizing way. I actually had a young person come up to me one time and tell me that my class had changed her life because the way that I go about explaining STIs is that, well, contagious infections affect every part of the human body, whether you're catching a cold from your friend or catching an STI from a partner. And really, it's that bacteria or viruses are transferable amongst people. Bacteria are living organisms, so they can be killed and thus cured. And viruses are non-living organisms, and so they're typically hosted and managed in the body. And that was just pivotal for her, because what she had received was, um, here's your period, you should wear pads, and here's some photos of STIs, don't have sex. And so seeing these images of like very extremely affected genitals before really seeing any other images of genitals or reproductive body parts made her feel disgusted by her body and her reproductive organs generally, and as well as others. So it was hard for her to kind of compromise that natural sexual desire with fear and misconceptions about the body that made her really avoid talking about STIs and health, not only in her relationships, but also with healthcare providers. So that was pivotal. I think that a lot of young people really seek out the internet to get this information because there's that, you don't have to have that face-to-face when you're seeking information on the internet. The one thing that we don't do very well is help young people understand what is the difference between sexual content that is intended to educate versus sexual content that's intended to arouse. And so they're not getting that media literacy, that ability to read, understand, and interpret the things that they're seeing and possibly the things that they're engaging with, to really recognize what is real and what isn't. So that's where we kind of want to take this strand on digital citizenship is what are boundaries when it comes to seeking sexual information online, and exploring one's own sexuality online as well. I think a lot of young people kind of have this idea that, well, I can't get pregnant through a text message, so sexting now becomes their way of exploring their sexuality. Again, those cultural shifts and why we're seeing that teen birth is declining is, partly because of sex education, partly because of wide scope of opportunity for young women, and also partly because a lot of young people are exploring their sexualities online. When we think about this, though, and how can we really address sexting and online sexual exploration, we should really approach this topic the same way that we approach sex itself. So for me, as an educator, some of the things that I say are, what are some of the things that someone might want to consider before having sex? And I think that similarly, we should be talking to students like this because currently we take a very fear-based approach. And I know that that's not part of the TEKS revisions that we're able to recommend, but it's young people have a way of getting around those fear tactics that we have. So this image is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. It's going to get in the way of, a job potentially. Well, now they're taking a picture without their face in there. So really understanding what are the boundaries around sex and sexting? What are the laws, of course? And when someone shares another person's sext, whether that's text media and they're sharing their fantasies via text or photographic content, what are the laws surrounding that? And also putting it on as a form of cyber assault, because similarly to someone sharing a photo would be in real life, potentially someone assaulting or making that person available to another person for assault. So thinking about how we can really approach that in a way that makes practical sense to young people, in a way that they can work that into their life. What are some of your fears, Jen, having young people yourself, having children yourself? What are some of your fears about internet safety?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I'm very worried about is that young people's brains are not fully developed, and the decisions that they make at the age of 15 or 17, in prior years may have been fleeting and not recorded, but now the internet is forever, and they can say a stupid thing at the age of 17 that will always be there, even when they're an adult. So that's something that we talk about a lot with my boys.
Right. Yeah. And I think that also falls back to social and emotional learning skills. Thanks for sharing that. Going back to that idea of self-awareness. So what version of myself am I putting out there? Social bonding awareness. So how does this give me social capital? Because you have to remember that young people, they don't have the same capital that adults have. So they don't have the same ability to bolster their status. Really, their status comes from their social networking. So thinking about myself, thinking about my social bonds, how is the person that I'm creating on these platforms that so many of my peers are looking to, one, responsible? what is the responsible version of myself that I'm putting out there, while still being relatable and while still being a young person, right? And so we have to think about normalizing responsible decision making, and that goes in line with digital citizenship as well as inclusion and respect for LGBT students. It's very, very easy to be inclusive of LGBT students, especially in sex ed, and I think that that causes a ripple effect. And so it, you know, again, touches on all of those things that we talked about before that TEKS is looking at within health ed: mental health, violence prevention, alcohol prevention, as something as simple as recognizing that not everyone subscribes to heterosexuality or gender norms. It instantly sets a foundation for those linguistic changes that are so minor, but so major to the young people who identify differently than what we might be talking about in a heterosexual sense. So changing, girlfriend to boyfriend to partners. Rather than saying his or her, just say they. It's that simple. And when you're talking about sex, define what you're saying. So are you talking about intercourse? Are you talking about the type of intercourse that could result in a pregnancy? Or are you talking about sex? Because when we talk about abstinence, for example, in Big Decisions, which is a abstinence plus medically accurate curriculum written by Healthy Futures founder, Dr. Raylini, there's an activity in there called Is This Abstinence? And it reviews lots of sexual behaviors that are not intercourse. And when you get down to it, you figure out, okay, what are some things that people consider when they're making a plan to be abstinent? Where are their boundaries and limits so that they don't accidentally go into having sex, or that they're not tempted into having sex? By sex, I mean sexual intercourse. But a really easy transition for that would be, this is sex, but if someone is choosing abstinence, what does that mean for them? And remember that regardless of what constitutes as sex for someone, abstinence absolutely includes abstaining from sexual intercourse. So those different types of sexual behaviors that can transmit an STI or cause pregnancy, right? And so these little changes now become so much more inclusive to LGBTQ students, and they don't feel like they have to shut down or tune out from this education because somehow it's not applicable to them. Now you're opening up the education, you're making it applicable to everyone listening.
Mm-hmm. And we know it's so important for so many reasons for all students to see themselves reflected in curriculum, especially for LGBTQ students. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Eleni. There are a lot of things to think about as this language is developed, and a lot of fine-tuning that we'll hopefully be doing. So we'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of the TEKS revision process that will be taking place over the next year. So the SBOE already has appointed a permanent advisory group that will work to oversee the content revision. However, they are still recruiting for a series of revolving work groups that will draft the actual language for the TEKS revision. And so these revolving work groups are made up of various content experts, educators, and we will provide the information on how to apply to serve on one of those work groups. I know that some of our attendees have already applied to serve on the work groups. And then finally, the actual State Board of Education members will debate the revisions. So we recently had a January meeting in which we provided testimony in support of general positive revisions to the health TEKS. We will also have meetings in April, June, and September. We are tentatively anticipating that final vote in September, though it's possible that it could happen in November. You will notice that these are long meeting blocks. They are several days each. We get the meeting agenda about a week to a week and a half prior to the actual meeting dates. We often have an idea ahead of time which day the testimony opportunity will be, but we don't know for sure until about a week or a week and a half before those meeting dates. So it does require some flexibility on the calendar if you want to actually testify at a meeting. All right, so finding out who represents you. So there are 15 members on the State Board of Education. They each have districts that number in the millions of constituents. And we would like you to take a moment to find out who your member is. So we have just pasted a link in the chat box, or you can use your phone to try to take a picture of the QR code, and that will open up an internet link that will take you to a website. You can enter in your information and you can find out who your State Board of Education member is. We would love for you to do it right now so that you know for sure. And we'll give everyone just 1 minute to work through that tech. And if you have any trouble making it work right now, or if you're joining us on the phone, we will send out this link in the follow-up email. All right, and while you're doing that, we will move along to some specific ways that you can actually advocate for sex education. So the first is to call or email or visit with your SBOE member. And again, now you know who your member is, and their contact information is also in that link. Now, for those of you who are familiar with legislative advocacy, this might feel somewhat different. SBOE members don't have permanent staff. They don't have set offices. They work largely on a volunteer basis, and they have extremely large districts. Some of them can be a bit difficult to get in touch with, but keep trying. You can also apply to serve on the TEKS work group as a content expert, and we have a link below that will show you how to do that. We also encourage you to consider testifying at the SBOE hearing in Austin. Again, we have at least 3 more meeting opportunities for testimony, and some of you have already been in touch on how to do that. You can meet with your SBOE member in your local district if you're able to set up an appointment. We also think it's crucially important to educate and activate other community members. So take a moment to think of 1 or 2 or 3 people that you might know that you want to tell about this topic. They could be friends, they could be community members, they could be youth-serving professionals who also work on this issue. Just take a moment and jot down 2 or 3 names and make yourself a promise that you will share this information with them. One advocacy method that can be extremely helpful is collecting stories to use to support advocacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. You can also share info on social media. And so to that line, we have some social media graphics that are ready for you to download and use on our new website, texasisready.org, linked here. And we have that website in conjunction with Healthy Futures and also with our partners in Dallas, Interrupt. And finally, you can come to the Texas Campaigns Day at the Capitol in 2021. The SBOE advocacy will be over by then, but we will be in legislative advocacy, and we will send out information on that. So one thing that we know is that data doesn't change minds. We know that stories and storytelling change minds. So to that line, Eleni is going to walk us through a messaging activity. And we have about 5 minutes to get through this to leave some time for questions at the end. So I apologize if we're a little tight on that, but Eleni, take it away.
Awesome, no worries. I think I can do this in 5 minutes. So when you're developing personal testimony or even getting stories from someone else, some of the things that you want to think of is, what was life like before you or that person had sexual health education? What was it like beginning that kind of educational journey? And when it got down to it and accepting and really supporting sex ed, what was that like as well? So actually, Jen, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few questions and we're going to build out a really quick testimony for you.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
All right. So again, back to that first portion, what was life like before sex ed? So what happened before you, had this type of education? What was your life like in a way that others can relate to?
So I had my first real sex education in college. I think, like many people, I took a human sexuality class at the university level, and it was really pretty life-changing. It made me realize how fantastic human bodies are, and how beautifully designed they can be, and really shifted my perception on a lot of things. And before that, you know, I think I felt more uncomfortable with the human body. So it was a big shift for me.
Yeah. So you said before that maybe you were uncomfortable. What were your beliefs or ideas about sex or sexual health, and where did you get that information from?
You know, I did not get it from my parents. Despite growing up in a medical family, we did not talk about sex. I was, one of the smart girls who sought out information, but this was in the pre-internet days. So I got some information from a clinician. I got some information from middle school sex ed, and I think I just sort of scrabbled around for the rest, but I didn't feel like I had a high quality source of this information.
Awesome. So when you first kind of began that educational journey, what was what were your initial reactions to that first meaningful conversation that you really had about sex?
hmm it was a revelation, and also to realize that I could make these decisions for myself, that were good for me in the long term, whether it was around risk reduction or exploration, and having that factual and accurate and open information made a real difference for me.
Was there anything that you had to like reconcile from your previous beliefs with the new information you received?
I think I had so little information that there wasn't a whole lot that I had to actually reconcile.
Oh, okay, very good. So when it came to accepting and supporting sex ed, um, how is your life different after having received that education? Be very specific. Were there any character changes or relationship changes, attitude, outlook? Did you have a new sense of opportunity?
hmm So, now obviously working in reproductive health policy, I feel like I have the information that I need to make really good decisions for my own health and relationships. And having all of that information has made it easier for me to plan the course of my life, including things like going to grad school and pursuing careers, and planning and spacing pregnancies, but also just feeling in control of my own health and relationships. So it's been immensely empowering. And that's something that I want everyone to have access to.
Absolutely. I agree. I'm with you there 100%. Um, what motivates you to garner support for sex ed as well? So why do you want other people to feel the same way about sexual health as you do?
hmm Because I think it's something that our youth deserve from a human rights perspective. I think that fundamentally people have a right to this information that they can use to make decisions for themselves about their bodies and about their health and about their relationships. I think it's good for society, but fundamentally I work at the level of the individual making decisions for themselves and having that information. And that's something that I want for my own children, and it's something that I want for the youth in my community and my state.
I agree. And the United Nations Education and Science Organization, and Cultural Organization, they actually put out a technical guidance on sexuality education, really taking a perspective of human rights. So when you think about a future where all young people receive this type of education, what changes do you believe will happen in our society?
I see a society that is more grounded in topics like mutual respect and consent. I also see a society where more people are able to have intentional pregnancies in the time that they want. And ultimately, I see a society that's empowered and has control over their futures.
Awesome, Jen. So we just reviewed your life before sex ed. We talked about what it was like receiving that education, and we talked about what it was like becoming a supporter of sex ed, and really developed a good message here. So if I may kick it back and tell me if I'm getting anything wrong. Um, Before sex ed, you felt pretty uncomfortable with the topic. You didn't get a lot of information from your parents and certainly not school. In fact, it was kind of stigmatizing. So you scoured the planet for information, if I may, and you got some pre-internet information from clinicians, but you had that meaningful conversation in college where it was life-changing, and you developed a perception of your life that allowed you to feel that you could take control. It was more or less a revelation of the fact that you can make decisions for yourself and really plan your life intentionally. There wasn't much to reconcile between your beliefs before and these new ideas and understandings, because you didn't really have beliefs or ideas about it before at all. It was just kind of a void there in your life. So it's changed your life because now that you're working in policy, you are able to better support young people and the people who are really affected and are stakeholders in this. It's made it easier for you to plan your course of life. You feel very much in control and empowered by this. You support it because all humans deserve this type of education. You work on an individual basis, and you believe that every single individual you encounter has the human rights to sex education. And you believe that a society who is founded in this type of education will be grounded and able to intentionally plan and empower themselves as they move forward in their lives. Is that about the testimony that you've got?
That's about great. Send me those notes, because that'll save me hours next time I have to craft testimony for
Of
this.
course.
Thank
And
you
I
so
can make
much.
these notes available as well for any listeners today.
Wonderful. Well, we hope that this is useful to you as you think about the stories that you have to tell about why you're supporting sex education. And I think Eleni has already covered most of this, but to advocate effectively, storytelling changes minds. Be informed about the topic if you can be. You don't have to be an expert, though. Know the audience that you're talking to. Different policymakers will be swayed by different items. Find the common ground that you can find. It's a hard thing to do nowadays in this political climate, but there is common ground to be found, and it's helpful. Know what you're asking for, and of course, always use your manners and say thank you afterwards. So just a quick slide on some of the regulations around advocacy or lobbying, especially for those of us who work for nonprofits. So first off, what is advocacy and what is lobbying? So let's start with what lobbying is. Lobbying is direct communications with members of the legislature or executive branch to influence legislation or administrative action. So that is a specific ask around a specific change or bill. However, advocacy is not that. Advocacy is things like general education to elected officials on topics like why sex education is important or what your organization does. And advocacy also includes things like writing fact sheets, reaching out to the media, or doing advocacy training for your own membership. Private individuals can lobby within certain restrictions. You have to register as a lobbyist if you earn more than $1,000 per quarter lobbying, or if you spend more than $500 per quarter lobbying. Nonprofit organizations are allowed to lobby, but they have to follow certain limits. They should elect the 501H form, which allows more generous limits. They can only lobby within certain budget numbers based on their full operating budget. And they may not electioneer. They may not participate in campaigns for or against candidates for public office if they're a 501c3. Federal grantees may not use federal funds to lobby. However, they can use other funds within the organization that are not federal funds to lobby, or they can use volunteers, such as unpaid board members. And for those of you who work for ISDs, school districts in Texas are allowed to lobby. They're not allowed to electioneer, but they are allowed to lobby. However, they must use local rather than state funds to lobby. So if you are an ISD representative and you want to actually lobby rather than just advocate on this, talk to your school district and find out how you can do that within state law. All right, and so we have just a couple of minutes left for questions. So if you do have any questions, please go to that either that chat box or the Q&A box, and you can type any questions in there. And so while we're waiting to see if we have any questions, I would like to just talk quickly about two upcoming events. We have our 9th annual symposium, April 6th to 7th in San Antonio, and we are putting that on in conjunction with Healthy Futures of Texas. There will be wonderful partners in that. And you can find more information on that at www.txsymposium.org. And then we have another webinar coming up on caring for gender diverse youth. This is a webinar that will be appropriate both for clinicians and also people who work with gender diverse youth, and that will be in March, and you can register on our website. Let's see, so we have We have one question. Do we know which SBOE members are against the TEKS revision? Well, I can say that we have been reaching out to a number of the SBOE members, and we are getting not universal support, but we're getting extremely strong support from a number of members on both sides of the political aisle. We have not directly spoken with any members who are against all TEKS revisions yet. And many, even the more conservative members, are showing support for at least some incremental change. So we are positive about our outlook. And so we are right up at 1 o'clock, and we don't have any additional questions. So I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. Our contact information is here. And when you close this webinar, you will be taken directly to an evaluation survey. We would love for you to fill that out, whether or not you are seeking continuing education credits. We'll also send a follow-up email tomorrow with the slides, and we will link a recording of this webinar to our website in just a couple days. Thank you so much for joining us. Eleni, thank you so much for your wonderful input, and everyone have a great afternoon.